Hi friends, now we're going to read chapter 13 of Gooseberry Park by Cynthia Rylant. And this chapter is called The Weasel. The weasel is another character that we're going to learn about. Let's read it and find out. It was several days after the ice storm before Professor Albert took Kona to Gooseberry Park again. First they had to wait for warmer air to blow in and the ice to melt. Then they had to wait for park crews to remove the devastation of fallen trees. The sound of chainsaws filled the air, leaving everyone in Professor Albert's house with a heavy heart. Particularly Kona. He thought of Stumpy's cozy nest destroyed, all of her treasures scattered and gone, and he wondered if he really would ever see her again. Finally, Professor Albert resumed his walks to the park, and Kona was mightily relieved, for he had hopes of hearing news there of Stumpy. With the warmer weather, many animals would be out. Someone was bound to know something. When he arrived at Gooseberry Park, Kona could not help his hopes sinking a little. Nearly every tree had suffered some injury, and many had not survived at all. Large piles of sawed trunks and branches lay everywhere. The remains of Stumpy's beautiful pine oak were among them. Still, Kona could sense in the air a spirit of renewal around him. The animals were stirring. There was life. There was hope. While Professor Albert read a book on clams, Kona took off to look for clues to Stumpy's whereabouts. He stopped to chat with a chipmunk who had just awakened from hibernation and was still a little groggy. "Are you acquainted with a squirrel named Stumpy?" Kona asked. The chipmunk yawned. "Whose cabbage was it?" he asked. Kona sighed and moved on. Then Kona met a mallard duck who said that no, he didn't know what had become of Stumpy, but that the weasels on the west side were bound to know something. All weasels live for were gossip and sensational events. And if one weasel knew something, all the weasels knew it. So it's kind of like the weasels like to gossip. Kona thanked the mallard and headed across the park. Once he arrived on the west side, it didn't take Kona long to find a weasel. He simply stood on a tree trunk and said as loudly as he could, "What a strange story!" And sure enough, from behind a broken maple, a weasel popped out his head. The weasel ran over to Kona, sniffing the air. "What's strange?" the weasel asked. What? "It's about that squirrel who lost her babies on the east side." "Yeah, I heard about that squirrel," answered the weasel. "So what?" "Well," Kona replied, "I hear a dog on Miller Street. Do you know Miller Street?" "Yeah, I know it. Go on," said the weasel. "Well," Kona continued, "a dog on Miller Street has some treasure that belongs to that squirrel, but he can't find her anywhere, and he actually wants to give the treasure back. Now, isn't that strange?" "The dog lives on Miller Street, you say?" asked the weasel. "Right," said Kona, thinking as fast as he could. "And I hear he's planning to put a sign on his house tomorrow night so the squirrel can find him." Okay, so here's a picture of the weasel. Now think of what Kona's trying to do to solve the problem. If he tells the weasel a story that he made up, maybe the weasel will spread the news across the land and Stumpy might hear it. "What kind of sign?" asked the weasel. "Like welcome squirrel or something?" "No, I hear that it's going to be a sign only the squirrel will know. A secret sign," Kona answered. "Imagine leading straight to treasure." "You sure it's on Miller Street?" the weasel said, who was always interested in treasure, asked. "Oh, yes," said Kona. "Tomorrow night, a sign for the squirrel on Miller Street. I'm positive." "So, do you know what the sign is?" asked the weasel, his sharp little nose twitching. "No," said Kona, "afraid not." "Then what good are you?" the weasel sneered, and he ran off to find another weasel who might know about a sign for a squirrel on Miller Street. With a sigh of relief, Kona watched the weasel run away. Then the dog turned and hurried back to Professor Albert and home, for he had a very important task ahead of him now. Before tomorrow night, he had to think of a sign. So think about, Kona's thinking of a good strategy to try to get Stumpy to find him on Miller Street. I wonder what sign he might choose. Well, here is a prediction. A brilliant idea in the next chapter. I wonder what that might be. All right, so stay tuned. Thanks for listening.